Throughout the Second World War, there were many different people who came from ordinary backgrounds and ended up fighting valiantly for their country, against the evils of their enemies. For example, there was Mad Jack Churchill, who would claim that any officer going into battle without his sword was improperly dressed, and he would be seen during the Second World War armed with his sword and also a longbow. But there were many others who rose to prominence during the conflict, as their lives before the war would be normal, but they were then thrust into the heart of the deadliest war the world had ever seen. But there was one Filipino schoolteacher who became a guerrilla leader and commander fighting against the Japanese during World War II, and she was known for silently killing her enemies, and it's claimed she managed to kill over 200 Japanese soldiers with her knife. Join us today as we look at Nieves Fernandez, the incredible female guerrilla fighter that slaughtered hundreds during the Second World War. And remember, as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Nieves Fernandez was born around 1906 on the Philippine Islands. Before the war, she owned a wholesale business, and following the Japanese invasion of the Philippines, she ceased trading, and she also was a teacher. The Japanese would commit large-scale atrocities in the area, and it's believed that around 500,000 Filipinos died during the Japanese occupation. Many women were stolen and were forced to work as comfort women for the Japanese army, and they were kidnapped on the streets. Also, the Japanese ordered large-scale executions and massacres, and they committed scores of atrocities against Allied soldiers in the area too. There were elements of resistance and guerrilla activity that were successful, and as the war continued, this increased in its numbers, and it's believed that over 250,000 people were part of anti-Japanese operations, and it continued to grow as the Japanese occupation continued. These groups often gathered intelligence and smuggled it to American forces, but they also suffered from a lack of equipment and weapons. There also wasn't much coordination between different groups, but then more supplies were delivered to guerrilla groups. Some of the crimes committed were truly shocking, including prisoners of war being tortured, and they were then forced into the open and were beaten by Japanese forces. Many were also forced into sadistic medical experiments and surgery without anaesthetic, which resulted in death. Others were forced to drink excessive amounts of water, and they were then tied to the ground, and Japanese guards then jumped up and down on their stomachs. But Nieves Fernandez was living dangerously, and as she was also a schoolteacher, she was concerned that her students would be forcibly taken by the Japanese, and she also worried for herself. She worried that her female students would be kidnapped and forced into comfort stations, and Fernandez then decided that enough was enough, and she took up arms against the occupation. She gathered a group of native men, and together they began to plan how to fight the occupying Japanese soldiers and forces. They believed that stealth actions were more successful, and she then began to train her men how to fight, and also how to kill using knives discreetly. They also would make clandestine weapons such as shotguns from gas pipes, which were loaded with gunpowder and rusty nails, and she also with her group made grenades. They did manage to steal some Japanese weapons, but with this she became the only female guerrilla commander inside of the Philippines. Neves herself was considered a talented shot and markswoman, but also was a bolo fighter. She used a bolo knife as it was easy to get hold of, as it was used for clearing vegetation in difficult terrain. But she became a silent killer, and she developed a technique that was deadly and terrifying. She was a silent assassin, and she would wear a black dress and would fight barefooted so no one could hear her. Her technique specifically was to stab the enemy behind and below the earlobe, which would sever the carotid artery and the internal jugular. This led to the brain and immediately forced a soldier to lose consciousness. The blade would be stabbed 2 inches, and she would then twist it 90 degrees. This made the victim unable to gasp for air or scream for help, and the only sound would be the struggle from the victim, but it was most probable that they were already out cold before they succumbed to their deaths. The Japanese forces began to fear her greatly, and she and her men carried out a number of ambushes on the Japanese under the cover of darkness. They would walk throughout the jungle and ambush the soldiers, and her 110 men as they carried out attacks near to Tacloban, and over the course of 2.5 years would kill more than 200 Japanese soldiers. The Japanese were confused as to who was carrying out these killings in the jungle to begin with, but then they heard about Nieves Fernandez, the woman leading a group of resistance fighters in the jungle, and they offered a reward of 10,000 Philippine pesos on her head and placed a bounty on her. Some people did try to hunt for her, but she managed to evade capture and survive the war. It was also claimed that her guerrillas also managed to save many women who had been assaulted or were about to be assaulted by the Japanese. They also managed to save some women from being taken into slavery by the forces, and also in certain villages they managed to completely liberate them of enemy soldiers, wiping out the complete enemy presence in them. At the end of the Second World War, the Americans arrived nearby, and Fernandez and her forces had already liberated many villages and also freed some comfort women. She was pictured showing some Americans her method of killing, but the only article ever published on her at the time of the war said, "A prim former school teacher, so far as known, here the only woman to fight 2.5 years with Filipino guerrillas, told today how she commanded 110 natives, who killed 200 Japanese with shotguns made from a section of gas pipes. That was when they called me Captain Nieves Fernandez," she said. "Now I'm just Miss Fernandez. Paler than most native women in this section, her name Neves is a Spanish word for snows. Miss Fernandez was without shoes and was attired in a plain black frock, as she conferred with American officers. She is 38 years old at present." After teaching school at Tacloban, the capital recently occupied by American forces, invading the Japanese Philippines, Miss Fernandez said she developed a wholesale business of her own. But when the Japanese came, she related, no one could keep anything. They took everything they wanted. They had ways of persuading, like giving you scalding hot baths and freezing cold baths alternately, with never a rest, never any food, never any water except the soapy water in the baths. Working with guerrillas south of Tacloban, Miss Fernandez rounded up native men to resist the Japanese. These men, she said, had 3 American rifles. The rest they made themselves out of a gas pipe. They loaded them with gunpowder and old nails. They also made grenades, and sometimes they got hold of Japanese weapons. US intelligence officers said the Japanese offered 10,000 pesos for her head. She was wounded once. There is a bullet scar on her right forearm. Nieves Fernandez was an ex-schoolteacher who saw her role in the Second World War and to take up arms against the Japanese occupation. She was a formidable and terrifying leader who developed a fearsome method of killing that was incredibly effective. Today she is considered the feared female guerrilla captain who slaughtered hundreds of Japanese forces in the Philippines. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.